armed recorders today, attempting to stay on message.
Nice to meet you. Yeah.
Casting for the votes of weekend warriors.
You're a generous teacher.
$20 million for fishing, boating and camping.
The Prime Minister did not hold a press conference today or take questions from journalists.
He preferred the company of a hand-picked audience of the party faithful.
The Prime Minister was on hand at a Greek Orthodox Mass in Correspondent.
Burning the midnight oil last night, attending a traditional Easter service.
And with Anthony Albanese in COVID isolation, his deputy Richard Marles stepped up.
Under pressure. Forced to defend himself against accusations he's a soft touch on China in the Pacific.
Very good.
The security pact between China and the Solomon Islands continues to dog the Prime Minister on the campaign trail.
The Chinese government does not play by the same rules.
Rolling into the Northern Territory, a hostile reception waiting for the Prime Minister.
Welcome, Freddie and Mark, to Alice
A potential test, isn't it, for who should be, could be the next leader?
Oh, we don't see it that way. We want the next Prime Minister of Australia to be Anthony Albanese. We're working our butts off to make that a reality.
Hey, Marion, how are you?
Labor's campaign has moved to the Red Centre here in the Northern Territory.
Luna.
It's actually a good way to then showcase, the rest of his cabinet that a lot of people have been asking, hang on, so who's going to be doing this?
It turns into a beautiful butterfly.
Well, Lisa, we're heading to the Northern Territory, but Anthony Albanese won't be there because he's stuck in ISO in Sydney.
Yeah, highly unusual situation to unfurl in the middle of an election campaign. Labor now forced to power on without its leader.
Why do you think they didn't just elevate Deputy Richard Marles to take on that role over the next 7 days?
I think probably a number of factors are at play. That Richard Marles is not necessarily the strongest communicator on that shadow front bench, and they've decided to elevate those shadow ministers who are really good at nailing the attack lines and really good at staying on message. That's why we've seen a lot of Jim Chalmers, the shadow treasurer. We saw Jason Clare, who performed really well.
Too well?
Almost too well, one might say. But I think there are also risk factors there as well. You potentially confuse the public about who the leader is.
It's unclear what impact it might have in 4 weeks' time, but it's better now than at the pointy end of the campaign. At least that's what Labor is saying.
In terms of timing, now is the time. And of course, Scott Morrison did opt for a 6-week campaign. He did that strategically, thinking that he is the stronger campaigner and he could outrun Anthony Albanese. But in the end, having that extra week might really play to Labor's benefit as well.
We saw a proof of life video from Anthony Albanese where he was doing those interviews on the Friday, but we didn't see him for the next week. We heard him in a few radio interviews, but it put the pressure more on his front bench to be out there selling Labor's case.
Yeah, there was an absolute necessity for the Labor front bench to step up, and I think, Albo being away for a week, I think that was probably a net positive, because we all discovered that Jason Clare had a natural gift for zingers.
They've got a choice here between honest Albo and smirking Scott.
We saw a bit more of Jim Chalmers, who's very good at those economic punch-through messages, and the whole team, Penny Wong, very good too. So it was, in some ways, it was a welcome thing for the Labor Party, for them to use that as an excuse to say, well, it's not just Anthony Albanese you get, it's the whole lot of them.
Some Labor MPs privately as well have been saying that this was perhaps a blessing in disguise. I also think that we've seen Anthony Albanese potentially have a chance to reset while in isolation. Prior to this on the campaign, he bristled a little bit when asked successive questions by successive journalists, but we had that bizarre 30-minute interview with Ray Hadley on 9 Radio this week, and he was incredibly patient.
Well, we will have no carbon tax.
No, well, let's just make sure there'll be no carbon tax under any government I'll lead, ever.
There will be no carbon tax ever.
It was not a Malcolm Turnbull, I will not take dictation from you, Alan. He was willing to take dictation from Ray Hadley.
He took, and he was basically, Ray Hadley shouted at him on climate, on boats, on his front bench, said he didn't think a lot of them were very good. And Anthony Albanese very patiently and calmly took those questions. I wonder if that would have happened pre-COVID.
It hasn't gone unnoticed within Labor about where is Tanya Plibersek. Now, she's out barnstorming those marginal seats, but the national campaign is choosing not to elevate her at all. It's a curious decision when she has some of the best brand recognition and is a darling of the Labor movement.
You wonder whether she's going to be used a lot more in the last 2 weeks, because the last week in particular is going to be very, very negative from the coalition if they are still so far behind.
We also saw a recalibration from Scott Morrison. After going after Anthony Albanese for the best part of the 2 weeks leading in, he pretty much didn't talk about Anthony Albanese until the last day, when he basically said he's been a bit lazy in isolation for this last week. I was very busy.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to him rejoining the campaign. He's had a pretty quiet week. I remember when I was in ISO, I had a very busy week, attending Quad summits.
Bit of a cheap shot, really.
We suspect that is an indication of what's to come, though, that we will see more of Morrison going after Albanese now that he's out of isolation.
Of a halt in hostilities on the campaign trail today as the leaders stop to mark Anzac Day.
Scott Morrison and Richard Marles laid wreaths at the Darwin Cenotaph during the dawn service, giving speeches that focused both on the past and our Anzac legacy, but also the current war in Ukraine and threats to our own region.
But our world is changing.
The only way that you can preserve peace is to prepare for war.
No point in beating your chest if you're beaten to the punch.
There was no political ceasefire with Anzac Day. Blunt instrument Peter Dutton was out there sending the rhetoric up to 1,000, comparing Russia and China to the Nazis. But what's been interesting in this week is that emboldened Labor that is very happy to go toe-to-toe with the coalition over national security, which many would have thought would have been a weaker area for Labor to be arguing about.
Yeah, who'd have thunk it that Labor wants to talk about national security, but that's the size of the strategic disaster that's happened in the Solomon Islands. What's curious to me is that even though there has been damage and the sheen's come off the coalition's boast about national security, they're still keen to talk about it. So the calculation from the coalition must be, even when we're talking about it, when there has been some damage, there still is a minor positive for them.
And they really opened the door for Labor to deliver quite a significant policy in terms of the Pacific, with more money for foreign aid, more money for the ABC, which prompted a few zingers from Scott Morrison.
Off to do Q&A.
Q&A in Honiara. We'll see you there, Probes. But it was interesting because the coalition wanted a khaki election. They've got it, perhaps not on the terms that they were hoping for.
Mr. Morrison doesn't like to listen, and he certainly doesn't like to act.
We won't be having Chinese military naval bases in our region on our doorstep.
And Maurice Payne awkwardly had to admit she hadn't been to the Solomon Islands since 2019. Now, undoubtedly, COVID has been a factor there, but when the junior minister was able to get in without a quarantine the other week, it does feed into a Labor attack that the coalition has taken its eye off the ball in this part of the world, that it was too interested in Paris and not interested enough in the Pacific.
Emmanuel Macron has won the French election and become the first president in 20 years to earn a second term.
Have you called Emmanuel Macron to congratulate him on his election win? How will you mend the relationship?
Prime President Macron, I have sent him a message of congratulations directly, and I've also ensured I've sent a formal letter to him congratulating him as well.
There we go. That's how you do it. Okay.
So we saw Scott Morrison in a French bakery.
Someone's performance appraisal. This is going to be mentioned.
Who thought that up?
Why do you mention the war?
It was a bizarre choice to position him there straight after the French president's re-election. It was very strange and curious, and the stories just wrote themselves. You all certainly did, folks.
Well, Macron, I mean, the temptation was there.
To quote the French president, and I know how to make a croissant. I don't think Scott Morrison had a terrible technique. I know he had a terrible technique.
What I think has been interesting in terms of Scott Morrison's language about his relationship is he keeps saying we are rebuilding the relationship, the ing being the key word. It's not rebuilt yet. It's definitely a work in progress, and this is going to be really difficult.
It's definitely damaged. And why is our relationship with France so important? France has 1.5 million citizens living in the Indo-Pacific. They are a key nuclear power. They're going to be really critical in this coordinated pushback against Beijing. So whether he likes it or not, Emmanuel Macron for the next 5 years is going to be one of the key partners of Australia, and what it's doing is shining the light on the fact that there was this real horrible spat over submarines.
Major cracks have emerged over the coalition's climate policy.
We have committed to a pathway to 2050, okay? We have committed.
Morrison's document is a flexible plan. It leaves us wiggle room.
Yeah, well, the net zero thing is all sort of dead anyway.
Just weeks before the election, the Morrison government's trying to hose down a new internal fight about climate change, which has blown up over its net zero commitment.
That's his view. It's no surprise. He's held it for a long time. That debate has been done in the coalition.
Yeah, pull your head in, Matt.
Manu, another day on the campaign, another manufacturing plant. And we're sensing a bit of
I wasn't actually quite sure where we
isn't
were.
it? I think this is where they make parts for planes, I believe.
Okay, very good.
You've written a lot about climate change, but it hasn't really featured in the campaign until today. What do you make of the Prime Minister's press conference today?
Well, look, I mean, he's been trying to mop up, I guess the mess that Canavan has left for him. It's an unwelcome distraction for the Prime Minister.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the PM also always says that he's the one that got the actual deal done. He brought the coalition together. And then in the middle of the campaign, you've got this intervention. It's hardly helpful, is it?
It's not helpful, but, I guess from, Matt Canavan's perspective, he thinks he's saying what needs to be said to keep the coal seats in central Queensland. So he's got his own agenda at play. He's not too worried about Dave Sharma's fate in Wentworth, is he? He's much more concerned about what's happening in Queensland, and he knows the message that he wants to get through to those voters.
And it reminds me of 2019 in one way, when Labor was saying one thing in coal mining communities and another thing in our more progressive seats.
Absolutely.
This is the same problem. Matt Canavan's creating the same problem this time around.
Yeah, that's right. And Morrison has been trying to sort of turn the pressure on Labor. Historically, that's been a big problem for them, particularly in Queensland. But at the moment, it's really the coalition that's struggling with those competing messages.
Australia's inflation figures have just been released. Consumer prices jumped 2.1% in the first quarter of the year.
Australians could be paying more in their mortgages within days after the biggest jump in consumer prices in 2 decades.
The annual inflation rate much higher than forecast, much higher than expected.
There's Australia, performing better than all of them when it comes to cost of living pressures.
Real wages are going backwards in this country, more substantially than they are in the US.
This is particularly significant because it's happening in the midst of an election campaign.
What Labor has is a tax, a sneaky carbon tax.
This bloke is so out of touch you'd need the Hubble telescope to find him.
Quick.
Australians are getting absolutely slaughtered by this triple whammy.
Scott Morrison had been copying it from his own side, from Labor. His dream was to get an election about national security and the economy. He's getting both of those, but like with national security, the economic debate isn't going in the direction that the coalition had hoped.
The coalition was very quick to spin those inflation figures, saying it's a result of external pressures, of volatile international pressures, and that we're doing much better than other countries. The reality is, do people care? No, they don't care if people have it harder in France. They know that their groceries are going up by about 7%, meat and fruit and veg, their fuel's gone up by about 35%. So what's happening overseas isn't really going to change voters' minds about this.
Yeah, lived experience when it comes to voters, that's what counts, and that's what the government is dealing with. How does Scott Morrison deal with this? He talks about what they've done, but what they've done is not going to alleviate all of those pressures, which helps the Labor campaign, which has at its core that everything is going up except for your wages.
And potentially next week we will see the Reserve Bank having to make a decision that the poor governor, Philip Lowe's, got a shocker on his hands that he has to deal with. If he lifts the cash rate, the coalition will hate him. We'll see what we saw with John Howard in 2007. If he doesn't, he'll be accused of political interference and not doing what's in the best interests of the economy.
Everyone in the coalition seems resigned to the fact that the Reserve Bank is going to lift rates. The question is, by how much? And also, are voters going to punish them for that?